Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversation I was having in the last one about the way in which policy teams can better respond to accelerationism as a set of arguments. If you haven't, you definitely should, because of the second kind of like two-part video for this section of the series where I'm specifically talking about how policy teams respond to this argument on the affirmative. And I think it's important to both watch that last video and at least the intro to accelerationism video to get some of the background for the stuff that we're talking about in this second video, because I think it's really important to have that type of context for the types of like indicts and arguments that I think policy teams should be making for the portion of the flow that I'll be talking about this video, when we start considering how the types of things I talked about in the last one affect arguments, like things that happen on the link debate, the permutation debate, impact comparison, alternative debating. And so I think overall, just really kind of being able to have this full context is really good to understand why the things that I'm saying kind of make sense when they're kind of like more contextualized, like being in a vacuum, and why they're kind of fitting around this larger group of ideas and videos that I've just kind of been talking throughout this whole process. In the last video, I think the stuff that was really important that we kind of began to talk about is the way in which we really want to take those top level considerations of the framing and thesis portions of the debate and really use them to like frame how we break the linkage between this stuff that the negative may be saying in the context of capitalism, but the way in which the negative responds to that problem via the alternative as kind of problematic. And I think that really pushing the question of like how the alternative is unable to at a level of scale match the affirmative can allow you to really make the framing arguments that we talked about in the last video develop in a way that I think is really nice, and also just in generally creates like more persuasive reasons for the judge to connect the like reasons why your framework is true with the reasons why your indicts of the alternative also makes sense, which builds a continuity that overall makes your arguments just stronger. I think that when you're talking about specifically like the link debate in these types of debates, I think that this is where the debate can get a little bit messy for policy teams, because I think both there are arguments that I've talked about that can be presented by teams that read accelerationism that I talked about in the videos before, where I talked about this as a negative strategy, that are more about the way in which you can impose particular link arguments that both come from arguments about the way in which the 1AC kind of like weaponizes and uses the future, and also is able to weaponize arguments about the way in which the 1AC just specifically relates to like capitalism as an existing structure for how it's like created as a policy. And I think that this could be a pretty hard place for teams to run into, because the stuff about futurity is meant to really gut check your ability to weigh stuff like the impacts as like particular ways in which the judge should evaluate, or push away from the kind of like necessity and the importance of understanding like the value of thinking through the particular questions that the link arguments are asking. And so I think that you need like a differential practice than just trying to push like why the impact of the F outweighs these things in order to really make sense of how you should resolve them. I think when I'm thinking through the best resolutions, I think that it's really to question like the way in which the alternative is able to reconcile these things without a similar type of institution that looks closer to the mechanism that the state is, even if it is able to break away from capitalism. Because I think that if you're able to win, that the alternative kind of approaches some type of institutional making or a way of thinking about methodology that requires a similar types of organization, you can say that there is value to the process of simulating the discussions in the way in which we think about the production of methodology in the type of way that the 1AC is doing, even if it doesn't mean the state is kind of like the end-all be-all for the only way in which we organize politics, which I think serves as a really interesting link term for how you want to phrase a lot of the other types of ways you want to impose like defense and offense throughout the rest of the flow. And I think generally makes a really good setup for you to push in, maybe not only, but also to diversify with other arguments that are justifiable about why the impacts that you're stating are realistic, kind of existent now, especially in the context of things like the environment, and kind of like push against the idea that all of them are meant about like this kind of like utilitarian calculus where it's like decontextualized from the way in which these things exist historically. I think that kind of like diversification of like the types of arguments you're making can really make it helpful for when you kind of transition to the permutation, and you're able to talk about various ways in which like the alternative, if it is meant to like operate in the same way, requires a kind of like form or framework for how we like discuss or create like tactics and methodologies for that institution, for what type of framework it takes under, which means that the specific types of engagement that the AF does, if it moves in the direction of kind of creating that possibility, is important. And I think when you talk about what like it takes to move to that possibility, you can say a lot of things, from like the idea that you kind of like radically change the way in which the state is kind of orienting itself right now towards things like the environment, water, structural injustice in the context of those things, or if it's a question of just being like the way in which we sustain like the environment, whatever, and so existential crisis the affirmative resolves, is important in order for us to think about the way in which we can it is important for us to be able to like open up the possibility for the alternative to exist and for the alternative to progress. Like the idea that there can be like this great transition to a world where technology is just used differently without the kind of like improvisation of different tactics such as those that like are embedded in the way in which we like reuse and retool the state. Only like it limits the amount of ways in which we can like create the possibility for change, and also could slow down that process. And I think also raises like the burden of threshold not only on like the way in which they're articulating specific offense on the link arguments, but also the articulation of how their examples on the alternative transition into something that is able to compete with just the pure like scale of the implementation of the affirmative. And I think that leaning on that type of offense can be really helpful in terms of how you kind of really build persuasive reasons for the net benefits of the permutation, and overall can just build a holistic packaging that brings the strengths of the AF with like net benefits that are created from like the types of link terms and other arguments you're making on the criticism. And then when you're transitioning into like the more impact comparison portion of the debate, I think that this debate gets like a little bit messy because on both sides you're probably making arguments at similar scale in terms of like how violence is happening with the environment, etc., especially on things like the water resolution. But I think in general, regardless of whether or not you're both talking about the environment, both talking about capitalism, the net better way like overall to really like interact with the impact comparison debate, I think, is to really go about trying to frame the way in which the judge should think about like, if we can presume the worlds of the impacts of both the affirmative and negative true, what is the kind of like solution that at scale is able to resolve like some of the immediate effects of these things in order to make larger structural change. The idea that any one like methodology or tactic could take on like the full weight of the entire structure itself like makes it impossible for us to make like any type of strategy viable that gets us like through things not only in the meantime but creates a framework for how we do things afterwards. And I think that creating that as like a basis for how the judge would have to hold like the affirmative and the alternative makes it much less strategic for the negative to really sit on that, and then you're both kind of stuck with impacts that are in the same place would allow you to really weigh that kind of like preciseness and offense that we were talking about earlier. And so when you switch on to really getting into this like crux of the alternative debate, all of the things that we've kind of been mentioning between these two videos start to weigh in as like pieces of offense in ways that you're thinking about the different like viability options for the alternative's existence. And also you have additional arguments about the ways in which even accelerationist literature can be overtaken by the way in which like right accelerationists think about the relationship between like capitalism and tech and use it to think about the justification for various forms of like racism and the acceleration of violence. And I think that talking about that and the kind of existence of that in a world where we refuse like kind of like slow transition that comes from the world of policy making can like weigh up a lot of different nuanced argument that makes it really, really specific to the brand of accelerationism. If you apply some of those things that I was talking about as like some of the major like flaws or indicts of the way in which accelerationism kind of like as a literature base has been so diversified, and really weigh those on like the way in which the alternative is able to not maybe have to like take full responsibility for those things, but combat the kind of like ideologies that exist in the world of the alternative. Overall, hopefully this video is really helpful for you, and hopefully you'll come back for more in order to get more of some ideas about accelerationism as a whole. And yeah, thanks for tuning in.